Thank you so much, Ann. Welcome. This marks the 30th anniversary of the landmark CFO Act. Christopher Columbus said, "You can never cross the ocean until you have courage to lose sight of the shore." We've moved far beyond the basic accounting, finance, control, reporting, and compliance tasks that represented the traditional finance office back in 1990. As we reflect on our many accomplishments, and all of you should be very proud of what we have achieved, we stand at the threshold today of another unprecedented opportunity to recast our profession once again through explosive advances in technology and access to unbounded data to turn into information. Through the eyes of the top leaders, and I use the word the top leaders in our profession, our superheroes, the Comptroller General of the United States, the Honorable Jean Dodaro, the Assistant Fiscal Secretary of the Department of the Treasury, Dave Lebryk, and the Deputy Comptroller of the Office of Financial Management in OMB, Tim Soltis. We will discuss what lies ahead. What's the future for us? Because we need to always be looking ahead. We need to learn from the past, but look ahead. And how do we cross that ocean together as leaders with an emphasis on leaders? I'll remind everybody to send in your questions through the app. I have a series of questions we'll start with, but I'm interested in what you all want to hear as well. So without any further ado, let me get into these questions. With great passion, I may add. Okay, Gene. On October 30th of last year, you testified on the CFO Act after close to 30 years, providing preliminary observations for the opportunities to enhance the Act. Could you highlight your thoughts on the end game of the Act? And a lot of times people don't focus clearly on the end game. What has been achieved, what remains, and as leaders, what we all need to do going forward?
First, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the question, Jeff. When I testified, it was based on the work that the GAO had done looking at the achievements over the last 30 years. And I just want to start out by saying that we underscored to the Congress the significant accomplishments and achievements that have been made through the combined efforts of the chief financial officers, the deputies, leadership of OMB and Treasury, the contributions of the inspector generals and all the public accounting firms that have worked on these audits over the years and made other contributions. You know, we now have a leadership structure in place that we didn't have before, both at the individual agencies and with the CFOs and the deputies. At OMB, we have a controller, Office of Financial Management, a deputy for management, which was created in the CFO Act. Treasury's provided great leadership and innovation offices and efforts to consolidate, streamline systems activities. We now have a comprehensive set of accounting standards, 57 accounting standards, and importantly, they're not just accrual-based accounting standards, they also look forward with the statement of fiscal sustainability to the obligations of government to sustain commitments that it's made into the future. And so they're progressive accounting standards as well. The audits have brought a much-needed discipline and accountability and better stewardship over taxpayer dollars. When we first started with the first set of audits across the federal government in fiscal year 1996, there were only 6 of the 24 agencies were able to get unmodified or clean opinions. This past year, it's 22 of 24, and the 2 that aren't are working diligently to try to get there, so that there's been thousands of internal control weaknesses that have been addressed and remediated at the agency, so we have better control systems in place as well as better accountability. The audits highlighted for the first time the problem of improper payments in the federal government. Before then, it really wasn't clear. And those improper payments this past year totaled about $175 billion. So we have a lot of work to do there. The audits led us to begin identifying the computer security information technology weaknesses in the audits and led GAO to expand the work beyond the financial systems to all government information systems. And we first designated computer security as a high-risk area across the government in 1997. So I want to take this opportunity with all of you here at this conference to thank each and every one of you for the great contributions that you've made to these achievements. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done. What we suggested to the Congress is to modernize the CFO function in the departments and agencies. Not all CFOs have the same functions, particularly as it relates to budget formulation and a role in performance and cost accounting, information, managing data across the enterprise at the agencies. We also suggested the deputy CFO functions be strengthened so that they're prepared to fully step in the CFO positions when the inevitable turnover happens because of the political appointment of most of the CFOs. So the deputies are well prepared. There needs to be better linkage between cost information and performance information, which was one of the aspirations of the original CFO Act. We haven't fully realized the potential there. The systems need to be modernized. While we're able to prepare annual financial statements, we need more timely, modern information that's available for day-to-day management and decision-making. And so we suggested that the Congress strengthen some of the requirements for systems plans to be developed and executed and progress reports made to the Congress. And lastly, the workforce continues to be something we need to work on. As we modernize the CFO functions and activities and the CFOs become increasingly more of a full partner in the agencies, they need a wider range of skills, both in the information technology arena, analytical arena, and other arenas as well. So bottom line, Jeff, is we gave a very good report on the progress that's been made and outlined some of the things that need to be done in order to realize the full potential and value of the CFO Act.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me now shift to Tim and Dave. How would you characterize the past 30 years, and what's different, what remains, and what changes in emphasis do you envision going forward?
I'll take that question. So the CFO Council has been looking at this question for probably about 6 to 8 months. And I think we break that question down and there's 3 areas. So looking at the CFO Act, remember it's 30 years old, 3rd major FM transformation law in the last 100 years. And the span between them is 30 to 40 years. So you think, okay, it's about time. And what drives the need to change is generally you see it in legislation that passes in the ensuing years. So we've been seeing a lot of laws around transparency, data, the CXO suite expanding, things like that. So you get the sense of the direction where the CFO Act isn't driving. So 3 areas we break like kind of the question down is the CFO Act is a really good strategic document. It sets up a structure. It sets up a need to transform. But the vision was set based on the situation in the 80s, right? So it was bankrupt New York City. It was no accounting standards, fraud, waste, and abuse, HUD scandals, things like that. So I would say that a lot of that, like Gina discussed, we processed a lot of that out, and some of those problems aren't there. A lot of the base standards have been created, 57 standards, internal controls are in place, things like that. So the CFO Act has the fundamentals because it deals with IT modernization, data, people, but it talks in terms of 30 years ago. So what I bring up is saying that the vision that you really don't get out of the CFO Act that we really need is four things, what I look at. I think there needs to be kind of a new vision. I think the vision that people took out of the CFO Act was get audited financial statements. And I look back in the legislation and the testimonies and things that created the CFO Act, and part of the purpose of it was to manage the cost of government. I think we successfully accounted for the cost of government, but didn't manage the cost of government. And because we didn't do that, there's not the focus on really CFO's roles in the debt and the deficit and program contribution to that. I think that we need a vision from 2020 to take us to the next 20 or 30 years. And I think part of that's kind of what we already have in the president's management agenda. And really aligning towards like where are we trying to take it, beyond accounting standards and financial reports and internal controls, where are we trying to get for the next 20, 30 years? So one of the key factors to me, it's really described that we should be integrating the government, right? The CFO Act actually built from the 1950s, and it came out of World War II, and it was the government's too big, let's decentralize. So the focus is agencies manage your operations. OMB kind of manage the overall thing, but there's really not a drive that the mission of the agencies are to integrate. If you did that, you'd start getting towards shared services and common data standards and things like that. So I think that driver needs to be a strategic vision. And I think, really, where are we going with data? What's the purpose of it? A lot of questions come up like transparency. Right, but if you're doing data just to be more transparent, it's not going to motivate people to act. It's got to be that the purpose of the data is to either better manage internal operations or to drive decision making. Then I think there's a few concepts that kind of came out after the 1980s. I think enterprise risk management is a game changer for how we manage the government, and I think really understanding that the purpose of either risk management, internal controls, is to have program integrity. You build integrity around programs. So I think that's kind of, to me, is really takes you to the next step, because everything, if you tie our things together, IT modernization, people, data, I mean, it's been there since the 1980s. We're still struggling to do that, but I think there's no like where are we going for the next 20 years?
So it's always kind of tough to follow Gene to talk about the CFO Act because of the significant role that Gene has had in making sure all of us pay attention to the CFO Act and even actually the crafting of it. And so I do think it's easy to say that the Act has been very successful in a number of ways, and particularly, it's given standing and credibility and position to the CFO. And of course, the audits have been, none of us in this room would think that the audit is not important and hasn't had really significant impact on how we do our jobs and what we're doing and why we're doing it in terms of improving the quality of data, internal controls and the like. I think in the areas where, maybe it's, I think that with the proliferation of a lot of other kind of executive office or jobs, it has, on the other hand, I think, the CFO hasn't taken full advantage of the position itself in terms of driving change in the organization. We've been perhaps too comfortable relying on the narrow definition about what the CFO Act asks the CFO to do. So now you have all this really good data, but we've had a real challenge of translating that data into something that's meaningful. And I think the CFO community hasn't done a particularly good job of understanding what its users want. That is, what do you want your CFO to do with the information within the organization to help you make better decisions and to run your organization in a better way? And I think that's some of the real challenges that one looks forward of saying, how do you take information, haven't really fulfilled the vision about performance in the CFO Act, been certainly a knotty challenge, a difficult challenge, but probably not as much attention has been given to what are meaningful performance measures and what are meaningful things that we should be measuring and reporting on to both our internal customers and to the American public. So I think that's another, and I think a second area where probably we've come up a little bit short is we've certainly made progress on core financial systems, and there's, I think, much more discipline around them, but probably haven't done enough to make sure that we're not spending too much of our time on systems and technology instead of spending more of our time on the data and analytics. So, I think that there's an ample opportunity for us to be thinking more about use of centralized services and centralized systems and better standardized systems that can provide the data. And then finally, I think that there's not been as much success in working across the communities, whether it be the CIO community, the grants community, or the acquisitions community, to be able to pull in data in these systems to make it useful and meaningful.
Let me kind of build on that a bit. The panelists spoke about the need to get to the unfulfilled parts of the CFO Act, and just to remind everybody that right at the heart of the CFO Act were three provisions: the systematic measurement of performance, the development of cost information, and the integration of systems. The financial audits were a means of providing discipline, and it really goes back to a report that GAO issued back in the mid-'80s. John Sherbini over here was involved with it. It was called Managing the Cost of Government. And let's just talk about, now we've got the Government Performance and Results Act, we've got the Data Act, we've got the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, we've got the Open Government Act and the GREAT Act. And how do you see all this playing out? Because these things are intricately entwined, as Tim and Gene mentioned before. And how do you see this playing out? And do you see the possibility of a different reporting model where we no longer have, for want of a better term, a governmentized corporate financial statement? We have a different kind of report. And I'll go to Gene first on that.
Well, first, I think two things as a backdrop, Jeff. One is these individual acts have to be implemented successfully first.
Yes.
In order to build upon them and have them be in a position to be integrated. I'm very pleased in the progress that's been made, for example, in the Data Act. Our review of the second review we've done is the data is becoming more accurate, more reliable. There's more entities reporting. These other pieces of reforms that you mentioned are just started. They're in their early stages, but they're going to make important contributions. But we should start thinking conceptually on how to integrate these different pieces into a more comprehensive assessment of performance. Now, we're at the threshold of a really significant effort that the government accountability community is going to be at the heart at, because our national finances are on an unsustainable long-term fiscal path. And while the key drivers are healthcare costs and interest, all aspects of the federal government are going to be under scrutiny to perform better and more efficiently over time. So I think the CFOs, as well as the leadership and OMB and Treasury and all of you, have a great opportunity to, in modernizing this vision of the CFO Act, also contributed to what will be a national imperative to better manage the finances of our government. We cannot sustain trillion-dollar annual deficits, and our cumulative debt is as high as it's been since World War II. These things cannot be sustained long-term. And so, but the real question is can the accountability community use all these tools that we've been developed to make a contribution to dealing with this problem in a most intelligent way by providing better information to help decision makers make informed decisions that'll minimize the effects on programs and citizens and other entities across the United States. So the question is very important. I think, we should always continue to evolve our reporting models to add value where we need to without losing some of the foundation that we've developed and worked so hard to develop. I think that the getting to the audited financial statements and a clean opinion was such a heavy lift in a lot of areas that we kind of got stuck there. And we need to move beyond that area. And I know Tim and Dave have a lot of excellent thoughts on this as well.
So I agree. I mean, I think that that we're at a point now where people are asking the questions. They're like, we're doing a lot of demonstration projects to start linking budget data, performance data to financial data. And as you do that, you show people presentations, they look at it, and there's a lot of, it's not a technology issue, it's there. So I've seen many, gee whiz, well, that's great, a U.S. map pops up and a nice graphic show, they shut it off, you walk out the door and you go back to spreadsheets. So the question is how do you change the way we're doing things? And the thing I run into all the time is the question of, what am I getting that I don't get today, right? And if you're not having decision makers making decisions based on linking a budget, performance, and spend together, why show it, right? So I think that's really the question, is what's the business case to make this change? What drives that? And I think that's where people across the board, you come in and say, well, how did you, and we're looking for those projects like that, how do you take the as-is process. Say, okay, I produced, I equate it like a Model T, right? You go in there and say, I want an answer to a question, say, well, here you go, an AFR. Like, well, that's nice, it doesn't answer any of my questions. It does give me some piece of data, it just doesn't answer the questions I want. So the question is, how do you answer people's questions? You gotta know, what are those questions? And we find as you ask the questions, you find out where the data's missing and what data would be needed in order to answer that question. Like, we're finding out like spend transparency around IT, cyber. You want to ask questions about that, the coding structure, the account codes built in the 50s don't provide that information. So even if you have great information, you're not collecting the information needed to make decisions about IT, real property, those type of spending. So I think it's really got to drive to what's the purpose of the reporting. Because if we think in terms of we're checking a compliance box, it's not going to drive towards anything except, okay, I'm done, and move on to the next project. So I think it's really decision making needs to be made by the reports we produce.
Change in any organization is really hard, and I think for most of us in the community, we've been doing something the same way for a pretty long time, and therefore, when you ask someone, for example, you've always given me a spreadsheet. Are you going to give me a spreadsheet in the future? And the answer is yes, I will do that, without really asking the question about why does someone want the data and what's the best way to consume the data. I think one of the things we've seen with respect to USA spending, for example. In the first year of the launching of the site, I think we had 400,000 page views per month, and this past month we're running at a rate around 700,000 page views. So what's happened is people are going to that and they're finding it useful, and they're saying, I want to go back to this site because it's containing useful information. I was out in the hallway out there the other day in the center and noticed that some firm is actually using USA spending as part of their projection, a part of their presentation about their services, about how you visualize. So sometimes you don't understand how the data is going to be used, and you don't know where it's going to lead to, but getting that data out there and getting people to sort of play with it and look at it is critically important. But I'd come back to that point again for our community. For us to be relevant and to be useful, we need to do a much better job on data visualization and actually asking people who are using our information how to best consume it. And that seems to me that that would be one of the best things we as a community could do to make ourselves relevant, and to make ourselves continuing to have a voice and make sure that that data is being used to make strategic decisions within the organization.
Okay, let me shift a bit here to the innovation part of the whole thing. Benjamin Franklin observed, I didn't fail the test, I just found 100 ways to do it wrong. In a 2019 survey, 68% of U.S. CEOs believe that being too slow to innovation can lead to obsolescence. And 92% want employees to feel empowered to innovate without worrying about negative consequences. And we know in government that's not always how people view the world. How do we empower staff to feel that they can intelligently innovate and sometimes fail, so that government is not left behind the curve? And what should the auditor's role be in an age of great exploration and empowerment, where there is some risk being taken with a tremendous reward on the other end? Dr. Gene.
Well, first, I think you have to continue to innovate to be relevant to the future. We just created a new science, technology, assessments, and analytics group in GAO. One of the components of this is GAO, to be relevant in the future, has to be involved in science and technology issues. But part of this effort is to have an innovation lab where we can experiment with new audit tools and techniques. How do you audit blockchain technology? How do you audit algorithms and artificial intelligence? And so we're going to develop audit techniques and tools and test them before we use them in regular audits. So you try to mitigate your risk while you're still innovating. So you have to kind of manage it going forward. But in order to empower employees, leaders have to make it clear that it's fine to do these things. But you also can't leave the employees out there on their own without giving them some degree of guidance and efforts on how to mitigate risk. It's not that you don't take risk, but you have to manage risk. You can't take risk and not pay attention to managing it. And so that's a very important component, and that's how we try to approach it when we go in from an auditing standpoint. It's not that you made a change or that you're trying something different, but in doing that, have you really assessed fully what the risks are and taken steps to mitigate the risk? So it's not whether you innovate or not, you have to, it's how you do it that's important.
So I agree. I think that that's why I think ERM is a game changer in some ways, just because it introduces, the purpose of risk, right? I mean, so you hire qualified people, that's a definite. So you got to hire qualified people, and then you empower them to innovate. What prevents them from innovating? In most cases, it's going to be that you're changing something that we've always done. So what enforces the inability to change, right? It's compliance mentality. This is how we've done it. I talk about the auditors introduce risk too, because they enforce compliance in a lot of cases. So people will tell you in an agency, hey, we passed the audit. If I change this process, the auditors will come in to have to audit a new process. They might not know how to do it. It might put our opinion at risk. Those things come into play. So I think there's this understanding of both an agency and audit risk. And then there's that question of when are you innovating and what's your risk tolerance, right? So you test things out, you have a lot of risk tolerance. I think Dave will say when you move changes into like something like buying bonds and things like that, you don't have a lot of high risk tolerance. So understanding like at what point does, you're playing around, testing things, taking a lot of risk, you're starting to move it into production. It's still it introduces risk because it changes the way things are being done. And so you've got to have that concept that when you change things, it may cause problems. And if we have zero tolerance for that, then nobody's going to take the risk. So to me, that's really it's a cultural thing. People will take risks, but they're not empowered to take risks because the forcing function pulls them back to let's do what we know works and everybody's happy with it. And let's not rock the boat.
Yeah, we've faced that challenge of trying to think through how do you run a large organization which runs mission critical functions, whether it be payments, collections, financing the government, and then how do you sort of make sure that you're rewarded in those functions for repeatability and reliability and resiliency. 100% of those Social Security payments have to make it there, right? You don't have a choice. If they don't make it there, there's a real problem. So you have a real risk aversion within your organization to think about innovation, because if it's working well, why would you change it? So I think we've wrestled in large measure with sort of really thinking through about how do you look at innovation and how you understand where you're prepared to take your risks. And we've kind of, many of you heard about FIT and sort of the notion of identify, incubate, deploy, which is you're looking at emerging technologies, you're looking at opportunities, and in our case, it's been things like the RPAs, it's been looking at things like machine learning and blockchain and AI. And trying to figure out ways that you can pilot those things at small scale and see if they work. And so, for example, we've had a number of blockchain pilots that we've found interesting things, and those lessons are important as it relates to, how do you talk to your IT shop before you do something? How do you make sure that you're thinking about how you would deploy those things within your environment with security and the like? RPA is the very same thing. Where we've struggled a little bit more is deployment. Which is to go to scale. So we've been pretty good, I think, at identifying emerging technologies. We've been pretty good at incubating emerging technologies and testing them. Much more difficult then to sort of say, are you prepared when you have to do $12 trillion of auctions to raise money for the federal government? Are you prepared to deploy something that has one iota of risk in it? And the answer is, by and large, no. And so, you have to sort of really think through how you're going to do it. So with respect to something like RPA in our auctions business, we've thought about ways to deploy RPAs in a way that maybe it's dealing with the data on the back end and not so much about something that would impact the actual auction itself, which would have financial implications worldwide if it didn't go well. And so, you think through, well, if you can make that work in a less risky environment, then do you get more comfortable with the RPA or the bot in a higher risk environment once you know and you're confident that it's going to work every time?
Let me touch on a couple of the audience questions. Some of them have been really answered during the other responses. Like, on the financial crisis, do you have any good news for this area? Good. I would say probably not a whole lot, okay? And there was a question, does the CFO Act apply to state and local governments? No. I think the concepts apply, and many of the concepts were taken from state and local governments. But let me get to a question here, and this deals with, have audited financial statements for every agency, big and small, outlived its usefulness? Where is Treasury moving to an audit of the consolidated financial statements only?
So you want me to start, Gene, and then you can think about it for a while?
You can start.
So I know.
I've thought about it, Dave.
Yeah, I know you have thought a lot about it. So I'll let Gene correct me as after I go through. Which is I think from my view is that what we need to be looking at is not so much are we replacing the audit, but are we making the audit better? So it's our ways that we can be looking at, for example, the source of truth, of looking at data. I mean, oftentimes what the auditor is looking for is discrepancies between what is in your reporting and what's in an underlying system, right? I mean, that's a large measure of what you're oftentimes looking at. And so I think that, our challenge is how do you make sure that you have more confidence in the underlying source of the data that ends up on your financial statement and the quality that's there. My own personal view, and this is maybe it's a professional view too, is that we can be doing more with the small entities. And I particularly would make the point that I think that if the small entities are using centralized services, I'll make a shared services pitch for ARC and for others, in terms of if they're reporting their data and you're in a centralized way, can it make the audit easier? And can you ultimately at some point simplify the audit and have more confidence in the audit because of the way you're compiling the information along the way? Can you then move that to a larger entity? I think that's where I think over time one would start asking the question, can you start doing some of those things and testing them in smaller environments and ultimately trying to apply them to a larger environment?
Yeah, I think the issue is, though, as you're doing this, what's the alignment between accountability and financial reporting? Now, any small agency head, I run a small agency at GAO, has to have processes in place to provide accountability to the taxpayer for money. Now, it's easy to say in the federal government level that $1 million isn't a lot of money, but to try to tell that to any taxpayer who's making their contributions to this, or the government's borrowing huge amounts of money on their behalf that ultimately they're going to have to pay back. So you need to do this. And then also, as we've been talking about, trying to make financial management more useful, it's for decision making. There are very few decisions made at the government-wide level. All the decisions are made at individual agency level. So you need to have a combination. But I agree with Dave in that, we got to make the audits more efficient. And the only way you're going to do that is to have better systems in place, whether it's shared services systems or more modern systems in place to be able to do this. It's been done in the private sector. Nobody's talking about getting rid of audits at large companies and doing let's do the Fortune 500 together in one audit. So I don't think the shareholders would go for that, and I'm not sure the taxpayers would, or the Congress as the board of directors for the audit for the government as well. So we got to find middle ground. All these ideas that are being discussed are good ideas, but we got to find a way to be more efficient while still providing important information for decision making, and above all, not lose ground that we've worked hard to attain in having proper accountability and proper stewardship in place.
So, I think that Gene's right, Dave's right, that that there needs to be a balance, because I don't think that what we're doing is the most efficient thing to do, or it's anyone makes many decisions off audited financial statements. The underlying data, yes, but I think, like, for me, that's why I said one of my goals, the next step of the CFO Act is the government's an integrated enterprise, because if you look at that standpoint, you're looking and saying that you can look at loans across the whole government and certain grant programs and things like that, and then take it down. And then if you're looking at saying, well, how would you simplify the audit? What if you had most of the data sets, like shared services, for entities, but also say you had all your real property records, your land records in centralized databases? The compilation of the financial statements from those databases would be a query. So is there value in auditing, the complete financial statements, get an opinion, or are you auditing the process because it gives stewardship? Yeah, that number that I pulled from the database is the right number for my entity. And I use the enterprise, I don't think we would want every McDonald's store to do a clean opinion. So I think there's this balance between, where does the opinion of Smithsonian add value to, the entire federal government. So I think we do have to have that discussion of is that model from 30 years ago still valid?
Okay. Let me shift a bit here. The President's management agenda calls for technology to function as the backbone of how government serves the public. We all know that to date the ROI, or investments in robotic process automation and other cognitive solutions, is off the charts. That's not a debatable point, really. But how do we smartly drive the adoption of these, what are becoming ever more powerful tools, in order to optimize outcomes, reduce costs, and then how will shared services and shared solutions factor into the equation, as right now a lot of agencies are adopting these tools on their own, which is great. They're innovators, they're leaders. But how do we pull this together? And how does this relate to both shared services and really shared solutions, so not everybody invents the same wheel?
So I would say where we started with our RPA effort was in our shared service provider, in large measure because there's a real drive toward the question about how do you reduce the costs and improve the quality for your customers, right? So it's a very natural place to start. You may not have those same incentives elsewhere in your organization as directly as you do when you're a shared service provider. So also at the same time, when you make those changes and you improve efficiencies, you're making that for multiple agencies. In our case, you're doing that in some cases for 70 customers. Right, so you're doing it once for 70 customers, and that's you're really leveraging that. You're doing, that's a big enhancer when you're able to do that. So I do think that the shared service providers are, really ripe for this, and they're a good area to be doing it, and it means the agencies aren't doing it themselves. As it relates to the agencies themselves, I think that, change, I'll say it again, change is really hard in an organization. And the thing on RPAs in particular is as you go and talk to people about it, they actually are quite pleased because it takes away the low value activity that they're doing and they're actually able to focus on higher value activity. I would say in our organization, the critical thing was to understand where is it that how can you actually introduce an RPA into your environment the right way? Because all of us are following rules. We're worried about cyber, we're worried about breaches, we're worried about, how do you embrace technology within the organization? So when you start small, you start asking those questions. And I think even in this month's journal of the AGA journal, there's a discussion about best practices that are there with looking at, how you, if you're an organization, how should you approach something like an RPA? And I think that's where you oftentimes have to start small and then you can actually go to scale. As I point out before, getting to scale and getting this something that is embraced more broadly across the organization is a harder thing. And I'm not so sure that we've solved that problem yet, that says we've got a really good idea, we know that this is applicable in many places across the organization, and we can start to deploy it in many different places across the organization. A bigger challenge.
Yeah, and I think that it's based on the business case because people will walk around these sessions out here and you'll pick up a brochure and say the latest blockchain, robotics and AI, right? And then you go back and say every entity doesn't need blockchain. It only applies to certain situations. And so people think, I need blockchain. Well, maybe you don't. So I think what you need to do is say, well, what is the problem you're trying to sell or solve? And what's the technology for that? I mean, AI works when you have big data. And I think what Dave was saying, that as you scale up, like we did with the GPC cards, those got way better and they offered a lot of technology, a lot of data mining because it's centralized. Everyone trying to build analytic capabilities themselves don't have the budget to do it and they can't do it. And believe me, I was CFO at Ed before I came here. You can't keep and hire data scientists in an activity that doesn't have data or will not go beyond a spreadsheet. They're going to leave. So there's a maturity level of an enterprise, for what level of data science you need. In some cases, just someone who's one step ahead of a spreadsheet. And the other thing is that as you're doing technology, you have to consider the people piece of it. Because we talk things like, I hate the terminology, we say like low value work, right? You're out there doing low value work and we're going to bring AI in to do the high value work. I mean, what's the message? The person's going to think, yeah, you're automating my job away. So they're going to naturally resist that. So the business case has to be, what are you automating and what's their role in that future state?
Yeah, I basically agree with what Dave and Tim have said. The only thing I'd add, in addition, is the importance of not overlooking the quality of the data. Artificial intelligence will help you, but it will not going to help you if you have bad underlying data. If all you're going to do is get a poor result faster, and you may get a biased result. Yeah, exactly. And so you really need to think about how you move, as Dave was talking about earlier, going for small scale, testing it properly, making sure you have things there, and then beyond the financial management community, but even there you got questions and ethical, legal issues and things. And if you're going to use it for loans, for example, and qualifying whether or not processing loan applications is there inherent bias in there based on race or gender or some other factor? Because you start with historical data, and so you have to make sure that everything is thought through properly before you do so. But I'd say I end by saying technology has to be part of the solution, but as Tim said, it's got to be the right technology for the right business case, and it's got to be properly managed.
Our time is running out here, and I've got a ton of questions here. I've got more questions myself, but I'd like to really thank our superheroes for joining us today, for sharing their perspectives, and for their leadership. Thank you.